Uh-oh. So last week, Renee got us uh, a real good foundation for what we're going to continue with in Hosea, and we got us through the first four chapters. The thing that we need to pay some attention to is the fact that in the first four chapters, uh, Hosea is dealing with not only the fact that he demonstrated the troubles of the Israelites in that he took a prostitute for a wife in order to illustrate in his everyday life as well as his preaching that Israel was prostituting themselves for no good eventual outcome. And so that is the personal statement that we find in Hosea. From chapter 5 onward, we never hear about his marriage, his home life, any of that stuff. But it is alluded to whenever himself or in the words of God says to the Israelites, you have played the harlot. It brings you back to that more personal statement right at the opening. The other thing that needs to be said, and Renee might not have said it clearly enough, is this is not one great big long sermon. It is, in fact, a collection of sayings from the prophet Hosea, the only prophet who originated in the North Country, in the Northern Kingdom, because he refers to, well, I could refer to my notes, because I'm not remembering, there it is, because he mentions Ephraim, which is the southernmost of all of the northern tribes. He mentions Ephraim a whole bunch. I count 36 times. These most scholars get the impression that perhaps Hosea was himself a resident of Ephraim, which puts him down real close to the northern border of Judah and Benjamin, the only two tribes of the southern kingdom. So that in that close proximity, Hosea is going to mention Judah from time to time. And by my count, Judah is mentioned 9 times. 8 times, Judah is lumped in with the same kind of difficulty that Israel walking the straight and narrow and staying in relationship with God. The very last time that Judah is mentioned in chapter 11, Hosea describes Judah as still walking with God. That alone indicates that what we have here is not only a collection of various sayings of his. Hosea was really good at preaching real short sermons. So all of those short sermons have been collected in a kind of random, they just tossed it all in a box and shook it up and pulled it out and edited it back together. If Hosea is a record of the misdeeds of Israel and the occasional difficulties that Judah is also having with being faithful to God. And then all of a sudden, late in Hosea's collection, we have a reference to Judah walking with God. That's a good indication that what we have here is a collection that's been cut and pasted together. It's good for you to remember that. And anytime you're reading, especially a New Revised Standard Version and a good many other English translations, you'll see these odd, oftentimes unexpected gaps. So there's a double space of lines. That's an indication that the scholars are kind of convinced that, this is one body of Hosea's material, and then something new picks up. It's been glued together or cut and pasted. You will find that in the Revised Standard Version, and it's helpful for us to remind ourselves from time to time that most all biblical literature is, in fact, material that has been brought from sources from long ago, brought back together, and pasted into a scrapbook so that you can have it all together in one place. By the way, if you ever have any questions or I say something that blows your mind, interrupt. It's all right. Ask those questions. There is no such thing as a stupid question.
The Hebrew text from which the Bible is translated does not include spaces or punctuation.
Yes. No
There's
space.
no space between words. No space between lines. It's continuous letters.
Yes. And it's like that in both Hebrew and Greek. In a lot of in a lot of the old ancient manuscripts, the Greek as well as the Hebrew, Greek will have capital letters and lowercase letters, but it's usually all of one or all of the other. And there are no spaces between words, sentences, no punctuation, nothing. So that you really have to know your Greek or your Hebrew to be able to pick out of that mass of letters the words that were written down intended in order for our edification. One of my professors in seminary said, before you can get to edification, you get to the hair pulling out frustration stage. And about the time you start getting bald is about the time it finally starts working. So be grateful that you have an English translation, and it, with some difficulties, is favorable to what is in the original text. Thank you for that. And by all means, if you have any other observations, barge right in. So in chapter 5, we have an opening line. You don't see this very often in Hebrew, in Hosea, but hear this, O priest, or at the beginning of verse chapter 4, hear the word of the Lord. At the very beginning of chapter 6, come, let us return to the Lord. Things like that are a definite marker of a beginning of a new section. And then there are all these lesser, smaller breaks that you will see indicated by that double space or that missing line in the text. So the address audience are the house of Israel and the king. Now, I used to think that the people who were being referred to were all of the inhabitants, all of the Israelites. But I think what we have here are all of the leaders of the nation Israel. So we have leaders who are appointed by the king and leaders who are appointed by God, the priests, who are needing to hear this word from Hosea. Most of the time, Hosea is haranguing these people, not the citizens, but the people who are leading the citizens astray. And the judgment is did you read it? Oh, okay, all right. The very end of verse 3. There's that reoccurring theme. Ephraim, you have played the whore, and Israel is defiled. Now, the one thing that you need to know is Israel and Ephraim are interchangeable. And I get the strongest of impressions, and I get this from scholars who have the strongest of impressions, that not only is Hosea preaching to the choir, so to speak, the priests, the appointed leadership, the king, and anybody else who's influential. Not only is this Hosea's audience, but they are having a profound effect on the welfare or the poor future for the people that they are leaving. So that will be a continual theme all the way through. It's Israel's pride. Verse 5 testifies against him. Ephraim stumbles in his guilt. Judah, there's our first reference to Judah, also stumbles with them. Their flocks and herds they shall go to seek the Lord, but they will not find him. He has withdrawn from them. I remember as a kid a discussion in Sunday school back in Pratt, Kansas. Our teacher was asked a question. He was an elder and knew his Bible fairly well. But one of my best friends said, "Why would God hide from us?" And our teacher said, sometimes God is just precocious. First time I'd ever heard that word, precocious. It bothered me. And for the longest time, I thought the scriptures quite literally say that God hides. But the scripture doesn't actually say that God hides. What it says right here very plainly, and all the way through Hosea, there are many references just like this, that God seems to be hidden. But we can be so blind by our seeking after alternatives to God, the easier God to worship, the strong man who looks a whole lot more like a savior than a nebulous, invisible God. So you go for the thing that you can see, and all of a sudden, after a while, you discover that you can't see the movement of God in your midst. I wish that elder had understood his Bible as well as we thought he did. I had a discussion about that very thing with that best friend of mine. First time I had seen him in, over 50 years when we moved back to Kansas. And I found him in a totally different town, and we got together at his house, and I floated that one by him. He didn't remember it. And I said, "Thank you for asking that question, because I've been trying to find the answer to that one all my life." And he said, "And did you find it?" And I said, "Yes." And then I explained to him what I just explained to you. God doesn't really hide. It's that we lose track when we chase after other alternatives, easier alternatives. That was very helpful to me. That was something that you ever asked in Sunday school. And he said, "Well, glad to be of service, but Steve, in all honesty, I don't think there is a God." And I told him, "Well, thanks to you, I believe there is a God, and I haven't lost track yet." So we parted friends, and I was reminded of that when I was reading and rereading Hosea here in preparation for this. map up here to give you an idea of the lay of the land because it's kind of important. From this point on, there will be other references. Something you need to be aware, or the thing you need to be aware of is proximity. This of Judah, the Dead Sea, the Jordan River. This is the Mediterranean. Here's Egypt and the Nile River leading into the Nile River Delta, the Red Sea. Here's the Persian Gulf. We visited this whole area a good many times with our armies. Now, this is the holdings, for the most part, of Israel. Persia, not Persia, that came later. Assyria and Egypt are both mentioned in Hosea. We know that Egypt is quite deeply here. This is the proximity of Assyria when Hosea, let's see about like this, when Hosea was doing his thing, at least at the very beginning of Hosea's preaching. It came. And the reason why I think that there's a great deal of turmoil going on, and Israel has had one after another of lousy kings or very short-term, unfortunate kings, is because Assyria managed to gain such a foothold and gain so much power that they swept all the way down. Well, that Assyria's boundary moved on up into the hills back north, and they controlled the whole Mediterranean east coast, all of Egypt and even farther south. And let's see. That was the Assyria within a matter of 20 years, or to the end of the about 20-year period of time Hosea was preaching. Now, when you see the size of Assyria and the fact that even Egypt became a vassal state to Assyria, what we have stuck in between is a little percent, a nothing country. The main reason why there's so much turmoil along here is because there's a major trade route between this power and the major power capital of Assyria up here at the top end of the Euphrates River. Oh yeah, the Euphrates River pouring down into the Persian Gulf. Israel is nothing. And the thing that is most important to understand is, as the northern kingdom gets swallowed up by Assyria, the very first invasion, Assyria's border came down and enveloped Galilee, and kind of like this. By the end of Hosea's preaching period, all that was left was right there. That's all that was left of Israel. Everything, if you have a map in a Bible someplace, take a look at it and you will see that there's a city called Samaria, right where I drew that little purple circle. That was the capital city of the northern kingdom when Hosea was doing his thing. And that was the last thing left. And it was not an independent state. The very last king of Israel sought favor from Assyria through old taxes or what do you call it? A vassal state sends tribute to the king that has essentially a foot on your neck. And that's the only reason why the only thing left was the acreage around Samaria and Samaria itself. So essentially, the last king of the northern kingdom was more like a mayor. So that's the situation. It only took 20 years. I won't go into a whole lot of detail. That should be enough to give you the idea that I think when I was in high school and junior high was all, and that it was powerful beyond all description because they were with God. And what Hosea bears testimony to from chapter 1 through chapter 14 is, no, they were not faithful, and they frittered it all. Okay. So I have a whole lot of notes here to keep us on track. And so, yeah. Suddenly I got myself totally disorganized. Yeah, in fact, that's chapter 6. Oh yeah, the troublesome thing about Hosea and a whole lot of the other minor prophets you will notice is that because they are a collection, you don't get a straight line from the sorrow, the repentance, the saving grace of God, and restoration. You go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth all the way through this. So chapter 6 begins with a call for repentance. And did the children of Israel respond?
They never do.
They never do. Yeah, right. Did you read ahead? But
Kathy.
yeah, thank you.
Not recently, but I've read it before.
Yeah, okay. Oh dear, now I just went and lost my question. Yeah, it should be. Is that door
It's
locked?
unlocked. You have to even find it.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is the very first strong indication there is hope. Notice in verse 2 of chapter 6, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up that we may live before him. This is a theme that gets picked up in a Christian context also. And in fact, there's a little bit of an echo back from the future from the Apostle Paul in the Corinthian letter that we'll come to in just a little bit. It's pretty obvious that Hosea was very well liked by the Christian community. So let us press on to know the Lord. His appearing is as sure as the dawn. He will come to us like showers, like spring rains that water the earth. But, verse 4, right there in the middle, your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. So God is prepared to rain down blessing upon Israel. But the response from Israel is to be like the dew and evaporate away right quickly. Their love is rather superficial. You see this theme again. You will also see references in Hosea to the willy-nilliness of the Israelite devotion to God. their devotion is divided. They're either seeking after alliances with the Assyrian king or with the economy of Egypt. Uh, they even attack in company with Syria. During Hosea's preaching, they get together with Syria and attack Judah, all in the name of trying to regain their former glory. Every time they seek after, they planted with the very first king after the Civil War. This was about 140 years before. Their first king, Jeroboam the first, planted a statue of a cat on a high place in Israel as one of his first official religious acts. All of a sudden, the sign of the presence of God is not as it was in Jerusalem, where on the Ark of the Covenant there are two seraphim and their wings folded out and covering over the Ark of the Covenant. Now, in the northern kingdom, the sign of the presence of God is essentially a golden calf. Yes. And some historical biblical scholars are fairly convinced that the reason why they did this is because among in that region, long before Joshua and the incoming of the former slaves from Egypt. So they were adopting local custom. By the time of Hosea, most of the high mountains that were considered holy mountains, Shechem, and starts with a G, Gezer, Gerizim, there we go. Those two mountains had calves on them. They also had phallus pillars there. It was a fertility cult. And every major city, including the capital city at Samaria, had a golden calf. That gets referred to here in, if you don't look it closely, you'll just skim right over it. This is the reason why it's possible not to be able to both worship God and Mammon. Mammon being not money necessarily, but any alternative that might net financial or political power advantage. You worship God, or you worship a very temporary, ethereal thing that can leave you as quickly as it comes. That's a recurring theme, not just in Hosea, all the way through Scripture. So, verse 6, I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. What was done at those calf sculptures and at other places where there were pillars tend to be on the order of a Bacchanalian festival, celebrating harvest by drinking too much, eating too much, and on some occasions to having, what we used to call free love exchanges with anybody who happened to be coming from other places. It helped the gene pool, you know. It was considered proper worship of God. So, needless to say, Hosea comes out of the woodwork and has a few things to say about all of that. We have a sense that the reason why Hosea stepped forward is because Jeroboam II died. His reign was long, it was very prosperous, and the people, were living the good life. Hosea could see, apparently, through divine means, perhaps, that this is not going to last. And so he began to share with them the warning of what was going to happen if they played the whore. So, skipping on ahead. Before we get out of chapter 6, notice chapter 10 and 11, verse 10 and 11. In the house of Israel, I have seen a horrible thing. Ephraim's whoredom is there. Israel is defiled. For you also, O Judah, a harvest is appointed. So see, even Judah, just over the border, south of where, Hosea is doing his thing, there are problems afoot. It's not going to be pretty. But in chapter 7, suddenly, when I would restore the fortunes of my people, then I would heal Israel. The corruption of Ephraim is revealed, and the wicked deeds of Samaria. We're not talking about an area like it was called, Samaria in Jesus' day. We're talking about the capital city. For they deal falsely, the thief breaks in, and the bandits raid outside. But notice that there's the promise of healing. In the midst of their misdeeds, God is promising to them that they will be healed. And yet they persist in trying to find rescue in foreign international affairs treaties and in gaining a foothold into the economic exchange that they can have with Egypt. There's a reference here to bringing oil down to Egypt. I assume olive oil, and the Egyptians bought that stuff up at about the same kind of price we have to pay now, I'm sure. So, great prosperity. If we can only become as prosperous as once we were during the reign of Jeroboam, then surely we can prove that God is on our side. If you prosper, then God is on your side. If you don't prosper, then God is hidden from us. That's a sick theology that is on TV every time I tune into the so-called TV evangelist. Let's see, we're not going to, all kinds of interesting analogies or allusions. Check out verse 4.
Which chapter?
Chapter 7.
Okay.
Again, they are adulterers. They are like a heated oven. But then there's this, whose baker does not need to stir the fire from the kneading of the dough until it is leavened. I kind of like that. It's just a cute little vignette into the mind of a prophet who will draw on any kind of common everyday occurrence to explain to his people the problem. They're a fire that stirs itself. The baker can just find the dough, the fire stirring itself. You are your own trouble, is essentially what Hosea is suggesting. Skipping on down to, here it is. Verse 8, Ephraim mixes himself with people. Ephraim is a cake not turned. In other words, burnt. Foreigners devour his strength, but he does not know it. Gray hairs are sprinkled upon him, but he does not know it. Israel's pride testifies against him, yet they do not return to the Lord their God or seek him for all this. Oblivious. Totally oblivious. Yes, Ephraim is essentially this whole area right there. One of the largest holdings of any of the 12 tribes of Israel. There are 10 tribes, all located here. This is Transjordan. This is the highland. And the coastline had a tendency to be sort of part of the tribal lands, but oftentimes there were incursions from seafaring people who used the coastline a whole lot better. There was a happy-go-lucky economic relationship going on there. But this is Ephraim. And Samaria.
Stand back and show
Yeah.
that.
And Samaria, the capital city, is right there in Egypt. And Benjamin is earnestly drawing all kinds of the northern part. So there's one reference to Benjamin, and in Judah, he's mentioning one tribe. So, another reason why all these references to Ephraim, you get the impression Hosea is, a product of that region. I drew some of the lines real broad. Can you kind of see that map well enough? Okay, good. So let's see. Here it is. Verse 11. Ephraim has become like a dove, silly and without sense. They call upon Egypt. They go to Assyria. As they go, I will cast my net. You get the picture? It's very important to remember that to the northeast, Assyria is very much in control of the whole area. Everything's really done. Hardly anything grows out here. So yeah, a prosperous and powerful nation isn't going to care much about profit. First, it has no fertility at all. But Assyria has swarmed down into Egypt and swarmed down into the Tigris River Valley. They've taken over everything in their area that will only make them a stronger nation. And in the midst of it all, Israel is suffering. So yeah, I would go on my knees and plead for some kind of help if I really trust God. So there's political pressure. And remember George Washington warned against entangling alliances as he was getting ready for his office. This is the very thing that we have done as a nation, and it's the very thing that Israel is trying to do in order to survive. And the end result is they destroyed themselves. So let's see. And that's the thing that probably ought to be mentioned that you won't find in Hosea. Let me run down through this history now. We've kind of set a good stage for this kind of information. Let's see. Jeroboam II died. Hosea begins preaching. Zechariah became Jeroboam II's successor, but he only ruled for 6 months, and he was murdered, assassinated. He was assassinated by the man who succeeded him, Shalom, who was only in office for 1 month before he was killed. Menahem is the one who succeeded him, and he reigned for 13 years, not without paying heavy tribute to Assyria in order to at least protect his people. During Menahem's, oh no, it was after that. Yeah, Pekahiah succeeded Menahem. We don't know how Menahem ended his reign. He may have died, but Pekahiah was the next king and reigned just a year, and he was murdered. You see why somebody like Hosea had a whole lot to say? After him, Pekah reigned for 5 years. But during this time, he allied Israel with Syria in order to invade Judah, their own kinfolk, in order to rescue the future welfare of the northern kingdom, which at that point was already dwindling. Assyria was encroaching and was coming down the coastline with those people who were not of the 12 tribes necessarily. So let's see. Yeah, when Pekah did that, Ahaz was king of Judah. He pleaded with Assyria, come and help us. We're being attacked. There's no good reason for it. And so Assyria did come down with their army, and within 2 years, the only thing left of Israel was that one little spot around Samaria. And then we had one more king who was put on the throne by Assyria. We do not know, and his name, I forgot it, starts with an A. Thank you, Hoshea. We do not know if Hoshea was in fact an Israelite. What we do know, though, is he was a vassal king. He was basically put there in order to run things for Assyria, and they kept Samaria alive, I don't know, maybe as a demonstration piece. When Assyria did, when Assyria removed Hoshea from the throne, because Hoshea wasn't doing things exactly as Assyria thought he should, they just basically removed him from the throne, laid siege to Samaria, and destroyed the city. There's hardly anything left. And the people who survived that siege were taken completely away. We don't know where. And a whole bunch of people from the whole Assyrian area were brought in to settle the whole area. And anybody who might have been left in the northern kingdom who thought that they owned property probably didn't have their farm anymore. And that's how you lay waste to a whole culture. At this point, Israel was never going to be the same. Interestingly enough, when Samaria is laid siege to, is about the time that we don't see Hosea preaching anymore. Either he saw that, okay, it's over, it's time to shut up and load my briefcase and get out, or he died. Either naturally or perhaps he was murdered. Hard to tell. So, enough of those notes. Chapter 8 begins very interesting. Put a trumpet to your lips, or set the trumpet to your lips. We're talking about a ram's horn. It's a warning. When you're standing guard by night over the city walls, watching for approaching enemies by night or by day, you have a ram's horn with you, and you send out warning if you should see anything that looks suspicious. That's the symbolism, the metaphor that's being used here. One like a vulture is over the house of the Lord, because they have broken my covenant and transgressed the law. Israel cries to me, to God, my God, we, Israel, know you. Israel has spurned the good. The enemy shall pursue him. It looks hopeless. Several times, Hosea puts words in the mouth of Israel or suggests that God knows that Israel is like that dew, that their love for God is like the morning dew. It's going to evaporate away mighty quick. So, verse 4, they made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but without my knowledge. It has become a secular nation. Or it has become a different religious nation. It may very well be that these kings were mostly put on the throne by the authority of the master, which in Hebrew is translated Baal, or symbolized by that cat. Boy. So we can, let's see, yeah, we can skip ahead. I think I pretty much touched on all the major themes now. Most important thing for you to notice is, oh, gee, there's so much that I could, yeah, there are a whole bunch of place names mentioned. And this gives time and place to Hosea's work many times. But there are some very big ones. I don't know why I feel the need to mention this, but in chapter 9, let's see, halfway through verse 10, I saw your ancestors, but they came to Baal Peor and consecrated themselves to a thing of shame and became detestable like the thing they loved. We're talking about one of those Bacchanalian festivals, probably an orgy, maybe something along that order. Baal Peor is mentioned just once in Numbers, in case you want to look it up. Chapter 25, 1 through 9. This is a place where the numbers in Israelite history, something like 20,000, 24,000 people came down with a terrible disease and died, which is another way for prophets to lay a heavy load on people. And yet even with that, as in a mother of one of my best friends in junior high, if you don't straighten up, you're going to become a criminal. Yeah, he did just like Israel. When we left his home and went across the street over to my home, he muttered to me, not even halfway across the street, yeah, I think I will. You won't be surprised. That's the way the prophets were treated. I'll show you that I'm not afraid. I'll do the very thing that you warned me against. My mom was a good prophet, but she never warned me that I was no good. She always told me that I was going to turn out wonderful. And it's too bad that there weren't any female prophets that got big press like Hosea. Yeah. Okay. In chapter 9, Israel's terrible, awful outcome is that they will, metaphorically speaking, bear no children. They will essentially dry up. and any pregnancies that might come to Israel will end in miscarriage or will just not fully develop. So, chapter 10, chapter 11, and chapter 12 just reiterate over and over and over again. And I hope there's not a section that we're skipping past here. In chapter 12, verse 2, here's another one of those demarcation lines, a statement that announces a change in content. The Lord has an indictment against Judah. Ah, who's Judah? And will punish Jacob, a reference to Israel. Israel, Jacob, interchangeable names. According to his ways, and repay him according to his deeds. In the womb he tried to supplant his brother, and in his manhood he strove with God. Hosea is referring back to their theological history. All of their favorite historical memories are brought up here. There's a passage where the the exodus from Egypt is mentioned, the giving of the law of Moses, the fact that the very first of their prophets, Moses, led them out of Egypt. All of that is presented before Israel. If they still know the story, they don't care. So, we have Judah mentioned there. Judah is to the northern kingdom their first father. Their regard for Judah is very much like our regard for George Washington. When King George III was King of England, our George was first in everything. The old poem that I memorized a long time ago. We still carry that, but talk to the younger people about George Washington, and he's very much an ethereal figure in our very distant past. When we were children, I suspect that in school we heard about George Washington, and it was almost like he was our grandfather.
Picture of George and Abe in most classrooms.
That's right.
Oh, just.
I have seen them. I mean, they're still there in some classrooms. Yeah, but it's not universal anymore. And this is the condition of the Northern Kingdom also. In fact, I would propose to you is the condition of all of these people. It's been over 600 years since they came out of Egypt. And they know the story, but it doesn't matter.
Are we going to read verse 6 out loud?
You want to?
I think it might help us.
Go for it. Read for us.
Okay. But as for you, return to your God. Hold fast to love and justice, and wait continually. Wait continually for your God. That's the message in tough times, and I think that's why it's so important to struggle through this.
Yeah.
But tough times are here doesn't mean God isn't. It means that we may not notice the camouflage.
Did you hear that? Sort of well enough. Yeah, the very next verse gives us a new insight into the problems in Israel. Corrupt business practice, essentially, is what we've got here. Is it possible to love God and cheat your customers?
One set of books. For the
Yeah.
IRS, for that.
And the other problem here, Ephraim is saying, I am rich, I have gained wealth for myself. In all my gain, no offense has been found in me that would be sin. In other words, if you're rich, God has blessed you. That sick theology is rife among us today. Anybody who's down and out and homeless, they brought it on themselves, and I'm not responsible. Prosperity gospel is what got Israel into big trouble. And I would propose to you that there needs to be a Hosea among us today. And maybe you're the one. So, chapter 13 really pretty much ends the whole discussion. There will be no chance. Notice in chapter 13, verse 6. Oh, yeah. The reference to coming out of Egyptian slavery is in verse 4. And 5 and 6 is all about, God being faithful to the children of Israel and their youthfulness as a young nation. When I fed them, they were satisfied, and their heart was proud. Therefore, they forgot me. So, and this is what's going to happen from verse 7 down through verse 8, 11. God will be like a wild animal, a lion, a leopard, and a mama bear. Will tear them apart and devour them. And then in verse 9, the metaphor shifts a bit, and they're destined to ruin. Just in case they didn't get the first metaphor, it ends with, I gave you a king in my anger. That would be Saul. And I took him away in my wrath. And it's, for the most part, been that way with almost every king that the northern kingdom had, especially after Jeroboam II and their last about 20 years of existence. So, chapter 14 has one last effort. Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity. And on and on and on it goes. Notice that all of this hope for salvation from Assyria is smashed to smithereens. Verse 3, Assyria will not save us. We will not ride upon horses, or in other words, we will not be a powerful army. The horse in that day was like the tank is for our armies. We will say no more, our God, to the work of our hands. In you the orphan finds mercy. In other words, we will turn away from international intrigue and we will become the people God intended. On the other hand, it continues on very hopefully. I will heal their disloyalty. I will love them freely, for my anger has turned from them. I will be like the dew to Israel, who shall blossom like the lily. Do you get that? When God is the dew, God stays. Or perhaps when God is the dew, evaporation will take place just like it does with the love of Israel for the true God. It all depends on whether or not Israel is going to be faithful. If God continues to be faithful, then surely the humidity level is very high. The dew will last all day. Maybe. It's iffy. So, one last word, or one last structural thing. There's what most scholars think is an add-on at the tail end of this collection of Hosea's sermons. And it's there in verse 9. It reads, the Hebrew reads a great deal like Proverbs. And it looks like a scribal addition to encourage people to read Hosea carefully and to take comfort or alarm, as the case may need to be, from the testimony of Hosea against Israel and Judah. You who are wise understand these things. Those who are discerning know them. For the ways of the Lord are right, and the upright walk in them, but transgressors stumble in them. We have ample evidence that of all of the minor prophets, Hosea was better remembered, and there are evidences of Hosea as a separate single scroll in existence all over the whole Assyrian area by the the 2nd century BC, or in other words, about 500 years later. Hosea apparently had a very good publicist, or Hosea had a word of caution that many rulers and a whole lot of people who were involved in leadership took very, very seriously. Yeah, I saw that. So, any final questions? We don't have time for them, but. Yeah.
Can you paraphrase that? They can hear you better than people.
Yeah, we just had a comment that kind of like the reference to George Washington in his farewell speech, warning against entangling alliances. That kind of apparently resonated with what Hosea was also saying. And we haven't done a good job of taking note on George Washington's warning. Yeah. Yes. One aside. The important thing about the prophets, whether they be major or minor, is that they still live among us. We do not recognize them because we are not looking for them, but give some thought to the possibility that Martin Luther King Jr. was in fact, in our time, a prophet. The possibility that we have prophets among us is all too true, and some of them have clay feet. But that illustrates all the better just how important their message is. So, we're done. Yeah. I wish Renee and I could have had another couple or 3 weeks. The more I read Hosea this time around, the more amazed I was